Welcome to the Physio Insights Podcast, presented by RunEasy. I'll be your host, Dr. Jimmy Picard. I'm a physical therapist, running coach, and team member here at RunEasy. On this show, we have real conversations with leading experts, digging into how we recover from injuries, train smarter, and use data to better guide care. Whether you're a clinician, coach, or an athlete, we're here to explore what really matters in rehab and performance. Let's dive in. Ben Cormack, welcome to the Physio Insights Podcast. Really great to have you here.
Thank you for the invite. It's my pleasure to come and talk my unique brand of crap to someone.
I've been following your work for quite a while now. You have like a lot of avenues out there where you're getting information out there. You're pretty active on Instagram, where that's what spurred me reaching out to you, is one of your recent posts, which we'll dive into. But then you have your Better Clinician project with Adam Meekins, where you guys do some kind of like virtual mentorship. And I've been in and out of that group for a while. So for the listeners who aren't too familiar with you or your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, of course. So at the moment, I would probably say, as you pointed out, all of the things that you discussed, I'm probably these days a little bit more of an educator than I am a clinician. So, as you get a little bit older and a few more grey hairs in the beard, you start to take some different avenues in your career. So that for me is probably the thing that I do the most now. So as you pointed out, I have the Better Clinician project with Adam, and then also my own company, Core Kinetic. And basically I just, get to give my opinions on the world of pain and rehabilitation and these type of things. And I do a lot of traveling and those type of things. So clinically, my background is what's called in the UK sports therapy, which is like the MSK part of physio. And yeah, I probably did that, when I say the best part of 20 years, I actually mean the other side of 20 years. Back in the early 2000s, I graduated in the early 2000s. So yeah, but as you pointed out, mostly what I do now is kind of what I'm best known for is education, but I still do a little bit of clinical stuff, probably 5 to 10 hours a week. If I'm traveling a lot, maybe a bit less. If I'm around, maybe a bit more.
So you joked about with age came this transition to teaching more or educating more. Was there something else that inspired that? Was that just like, were you seeing any problems in the physio world that you were speaking more out about more and you wanted to kind of dig more into that? Or yeah, what kind of spurred you to start teaching more?
Well, I always say when I teach, it's much easier to talk about it than doing it, right? So I think that's the classic, isn't it?
There's a joke, right? There's those who can't do teach.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Actually, all the proper people are out there doing it. I'm just talking about it. Something that I've always really enjoyed doing. And, if I don't know if this is going to come across as arrogant, but people have given me some good feedback in the past that they enjoy the way that I teach. They enjoy the subjects that I teach about. So I think that also is a catalyst to kind of, reinforce that over time. And I just think I am just interested in the research and the science. I'm probably not smart enough to be an actual researcher. So I just end up again talking about it rather than doing it.
All right. Well, let's dive into this post. So I think it was last week you posted, here's why biomechanics don't explain pain very well. Before we dig into it, what prompted you to post that?
These are things that I've been discussing for so many years. Look, I always describe myself like Taylor Swift. I know what you're thinking, Jimmy. How's this going to work?
I'm looking forward to it. Let's hear it.
So, in fact, I've done an Instagram post on this. So Taylor Swift has had a lot of eras. So her big tour was the Eras tour. And for me, I've had a biomechanical era. I've had a pain science era. I've had just pretty bog standard MSK era, so along the way, I've had everything's about the brain era. I've had everything's about the foot when I was in my biomechanical phase. And along the way, you kind of refine your thought processes. And sometimes you have to go through all those concepts and ideas to kind of refine your level of thinking. So all of the things that I post are generally kind of just snippets of the evolution of my ideas and the research and the evidence and the science along kind of the way. So I didn't have like a thunderbolt moment. I didn't wake up in the middle of the night and think, oh my God, I need to post this. But these are things that I talk about quite a lot when I present at conferences. I was doing a big one the other day with Lorimer and Chad Cook, and my title was Biomechanics to Biology. So just highlighting some of the kind of research that doesn't get discussed enough. We talk a lot about diagnostic research. Well, we talk a little bit about diagnostic research. We talk a lot about interventional research, like what's the best exercise for back pain, etc. And I don't think we highlight enough of the other research around comorbidity, around lifestyle, around social factors, all of the things that affect that human being and their response to the loads that we put them under.
And with the post, so that kind of brings up the post, because in the post you say biomechanics, this isn't a bash on biomechanics, but the biomechanics doesn't explain everything. If we start with the definition here, when we say biomechanics, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, great question. I think when most people are talking about biomechanics, they are talking about faulty movement patterns. So they'll be talking about overpronation, knee valgus, adduction of the hip, lordosis, kyph, whatever other kind of biomechanical variable you can think about. Whereas actually, really, biomechanics is a field of science. If you actually pick up a, Neumann's kinesiology book, or you pick up a biomechanics book, this is some heavy shizzle, man. You're talking about Newton's laws. You're talking about, some kind of really kind of tough mathematics and concepts and physics. It's not just whether someone's knee goes into valgus, right? So for me, biomechanics is actually a field of study that talks about forces, kinetics, kinematics, joint motions, etc., action and reaction, inertia, all of these type of things. Whereas I think that often people are just talking about movement of people or bones moving in space. And when people talk about biomechanics, generally, I think it's those select bad variables that people are often talking about. And, we could also call that the kinesio-pathological model that was, big 20 years ago when I was a student. So that for me is kind of the traditional view, is that idea of faulty movement. But in reality, biomechanics is some really heavy science. Anyone with a biomechanics degree is far smarter than me.
Nice. So it's like when people are posting and we're reading stuff online and social media, it's basically they took biomechanics and then applied like value judgment to it and said this is good and this is bad.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at most biomechanical research, the variance of the data that they collect is huge. There was a great paper, the Lundgren paper, where they actually stuck bone markers into the foot. This was about the intracortical bone markers. So that was Lundgren and Chris Nestor. And then they looked at different joints and movements around the foot, and they actually recorded them graphically and put them in the paper. And there was no two participants that were the same out of about 18 participants. And there was no description of what was good, what was bad. It just is and is. Human movement is really, really massively variable. But that makes complete sense, because our bones are different lengths. Our joints are different shapes. If you feel along a tibial tuberosity, some people, it will take your eye out. It will be so sharp. And then other people, I can't find it. I'm like, where is it? So our anthropometics are really broad and wide. And so therefore our movement is exactly the same. But we have this kind of really narrow, idealized view of what's good and bad. And that has almost no scientific merit, actually.
Why do you think that? Why did we go down that path with it? Why did that happen in the past? Why did we zone in on and saying like, yeah, these biomechanical features are good and or bad?
But this is again about the eras, isn't it? So as we go along over time, we build our layers of what we understand about the body. So the first era was, black bile and, the Greeks and, humans and that stuff. Yeah, blood. And all of it is just an evolution of our understanding. So, essentially, I think it's one of those easy variables that we can say that is the reason for your pain, right? So I think a lot of the time people want a simple, explanation for their problem. Someone doesn't always have the time or the inclination or the confidence to say, I don't know. And so what they end up saying is, oh, it's your knee falling in, or your glute med isn't strong enough, or your kyphosis is affecting your neck posture, or your foot pronation is affecting your pelvic tilt, or, and these stories become more wild and fanciful over time. And as they become more fanciful, they almost become more believable, right? And,
Yeah.
and so I think really it stems from the need of people to have an explanation. And ultimately, it's an easy way to explain a problem in a mechanical, understandable sense, because biology is really hard as well.
So that brings up a good point, is like the narrative that we give to the patient. And it does seem that it's easy to communicate it to the patient, and it's easy for them to understand and for them to remember. Cause I see patients still that come to me from stories they were told 20 years ago. So back to the post with biomechanics. If we look at the lens of this is correct movement pattern or not correct movement, that's what people are thinking when they say biomechanics. What is biomechanics good at for us physios? Where does the value in biomechanics lie for us?
So look, biomechanics explains someone's movement, and it also potentially explains the load to a tissue, right? So if you think about a knee, let's take knee flexion in a lunge. If you go straight down, you are providing less load to that knee joint than if you lunged in a forward direction. We know that from biomechanical research, that if I go more horizontally, there will be more load at the knee. If I go more vertically, I almost forgot my vertical and my horizontal. If I go more vertically, there tends to be less load at the knee joint. But what that doesn't tell us is how that knee joint will respond. So it doesn't tell us what the body does with that load. So there are two concepts here. One is the concept of biomechanics, and then one is the concept of mechanobiology. And mechanobiology is the body's response to that load. Now, the most common form of mechanobiology would be mechanotransduction, where we take load onto a cell and it produces a response, right? So if we take muscle repair, when you load a fibroblastic-like cell and it feels and it senses a load, what it does is it calls other fibroblastic-like cells to migrate to that area, and then those cells lay down collagen, right? That's the basic building blocks of hypertrophy, right? But what we can't say is exactly how those cells will respond to that load, because sometimes those cells don't always respond in a good way. Sometimes they respond in other ways. They generate neurogenic inflammatories, where they start pumping out things like substance P and calcitonin gene-related peptide. And they actually may be to create kind of more of a regulatory homeostasis. So rather than laying down collagen, or as long as laying down collagen, they also start to pump out nociceptive chemicals, which is a really wonderful way to stop you from moving while the body repairs itself.
It is.
We cannot determine how much load creates a positive and negative or a negative response.
All right. Let's come back to that in a second. Going back. So what you said was biomechanics can give us some idea of the loads that the body's experiencing, but it doesn't tell us what the body does with that, the response to the load.
No, it's an external measure. It's not an internal measure of biological response.
So I work with a lot of runners, and a lot of the listeners of the podcast are physios that treat runners. So if we look at like a gait analysis, watching somebody run, biomechanics would just help us understand how, like a rough idea, are they putting a lot of load through their knee, through their ankle, based on the style that they're running with. Is that correct?
The question is, are you measuring those loads, or are you estimating those loads from watching the kinematics? So now we've got two things, haven't we? So kinematics is the movement at a joint. The kinetics are the load that a joint is under, or the forces that are created, right? And my biomechanics is terrible. So, when we look at these, we're actually only looking at kinematics generally, aren't we? When you do a gait assessment for a runner, you can estimate that a joint is under more load, Do you know that a joint is under more load? Is the question, because there are a lot of variables there.
Correct. Yeah. So without tech, one of the sponsors of this podcast is a running gait analysis a software and device company called RunEasy, which is an accelerometer that sits at the sacrum, and it does give us some data on impact load
that's right.
and yeah. And so it's cool because then you can see, and then you can take the kinematics and the kinetics, put them together and kind of have an idea of like, this is where the loads are going. This is what we see. But again, to the point of the post is that's just one piece of the puzzle. It's one side of the coin.
Absolutely.
We have no idea because maybe we see a runner and the data is showing that they're hitting the ground really hard, but we don't know that that's a bad thing because maybe their body's adapted to that and they can tolerate it just fine.
Yeah, or maybe they're genetically able to be adapted, right? Maybe they're not adapting, they're adapted, right? Again, why do we see a very, very small portion of the world lead the field in long distance running? Right? There is some genetics going on there, I believe. Sure, again, yeah. I am no biologist or geneticist, but I think there's something genetic in there. And, so whatever the variables are, we are only explaining one part of the puzzle, right? Just because you have, and this was do you remember the famous Alf Nachmanson spinal load graph where they go up the stairway and they show the little man bending over and sitting down? Yeah. Well, again, Alf came out and he said, and Alf, Nobel Prize winning Swedish spine researcher, he came out and said, well, actually, all we ever did was explain the loads to the spine. We never explained anything more than that. We never said those loads were pathological or those loads were beyond tolerance or beyond whatever, right? So mechanically, we are only explaining the load to a tissue. And when a tissue is sensitized, is it likely to be less load tolerant? Yeah. Well, there we go. So we have something painful. So any load that you put it under is going to be a pathological load to some degree, isn't it? That's the point, is that we're not explaining currently how the body responds to load as well as we like to explain the loads that it's under. And there is two parts to that equation.
So how do we help translate that to a patient?
I don't know if we have to translate it to the patient, but I think the first point of call here is not making stupid statements like your knee is in valgus, so it's going to hurt, or, oh my God, sure, I know the reason your jaw is in pain because your foot overpronates and the load goes through the system and you end up, So I think the first point here is don't create biomechanical stories, So I think that's the first key, is that a lot of the ideas and theories we have, although many of them have been debunked, and debunking's quite boring now. I've been doing it for like 20 years. But the point is, first, let's not say, right, I don't know if I can swear. Can I swear, Jimmy?
You can swear.
So on my course, I have a rule. Rule number 1, don't say stupid shit, right? And stupid shit tends to be all of these biomechanical stories like your leg length isn't correct, your pelvis is anteriorly tilted, all of these things we know don't have great data. So for me, the first point of call here isn't creating a long-winded explanation to baffle your patient. More than anything, it's just don't say stupid shit. Let's just avoid the crap. Let's not start the crap so we have to undo it. Right?
Yeah.
But if a patient said something to me and said, well, that makes complete sense, I think, I would say absolutely it makes complete sense if we were cars or robots or pieces of machinery. But we're not. We are biological organisms, that are under mechanobiological rules, not a piece of steel that you can bend and twist. And, the more times you twist it, the more likely it is to break. That's not the human body. It just doesn't work like that.
Yeah. In your post, I think the first couple slides have a graph that I believe is pulled from Scott Dye's envelope of function.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why did you put that in there?
Because I think it's a nice biological model. So if you read, I don't know how many people have actually read Scott's paper, and I think it was 2006. Even I was young in 2006, by the way, Jimmy. Not that young, but younger, right? So Scott's paper was all about saying, forget the knee valgus, forget the tracking at the patella, right? Let's think about the load that knee is under biologically. And he says some really beautiful stuff in that. One of my favorite quotes from that paper, when he's talking about knee structures, is he said, how do you know it's just one structure? If all of the structures are under the same load, why could they all not produce nociception? You know, we're often saying, is it the ligament? Is it the tendon? Is it is it the joint? Is it whatever? Is it the bone? Whereas actually Scott was saying early doors, if your knee is under load, and I think this probably goes for the back as well, if your knee is under load, why is it we are looking for one thing? Any innervated structure within that knee could be painful. And it could even be that all of those structures in that knee are painful, right?
Yeah.
So again, really interesting stuff. I want to write a paper. I'm going to write a paper, and I wrote one looking at the biopsychosocial model, and I'm going to do one called Beyond Tissue Homeostasis. And the reason is because I still think there is lots to explore about how local tissue responds when it's affected by more global factors such as the immune system, you know, the health of the overall human, etc.
Yeah. Sounds like an awesome paper. I'm looking forward to it. Let me know when it comes out. So if we're going back to or continue on this theme of understanding the body's response to load, are there things that we can ask the patient to help better understand how they potentially will respond to load? Let's say I'm adding a exercise program for a knee pain patient. Like, are there things I should be looking out for to understand how they'll respond?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is probably, have they exercised before? Are they used to putting their bodies under load? I think there was a fantastic paper that I think Brad Schoenfeld put up a while ago talking about kind of tissue memory, so that we actually have kind of cellular memory, so that if you imagine the cells that are hypertrophic in your knee that are to do with that, they actually kind of even if they've been trained previously, they can sometimes or do retain kind of a biological memory of effect, which I found fascinating. So understanding people's overall health, I think, is really important. Understanding people's stress levels, anything that affects the ecosystem, understanding their previous exercise history, I think is really, really powerful. And then finally, I had something in my brain that was super important: aggravating and easing factors. Let's go back to Maitland. Sometimes there's their behaviors towards certain movements is really powerful, because then we can learn how to, offload, or we can learn to load a bit more about what type of things are aggravating or easing for that person.
I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, RunEasy. RunEasy is a running and jumping analysis tool that helps provide objective data on things like impact loading, dynamic stability, and symmetry. I've been using it in the clinic for the past 3 years, and I love how easy it is to add to my evaluations. Not only that, but it backs up my clinical reasoning and helps me with my decision-making process when I'm doing exercise prescription. So if you're a physical therapist or running coach, head on over to RunEasy and book a demo. If you're lucky, it will be with me. Let's go back to talking about communicating a message to a patient. So you use this dry forest analogy a lot. So if we have a patient, they're not tolerating running very well, we're trying to educate them and get them back to some running. The dry forest analogy, can you dig into that a little bit and tell us about it?
Yeah, so the dry forest analogy is my way of trying to bring in the ecosystem into the conversation, right? So as I said before, we talk a lot about tissue, right? But if we look at the risk factors and the things that affect lots of different painful problems in the body, we see lifestyle, we see smoking, we see activity levels, we see genetics, we see all of these different factors have a kind of an effect on how people develop and maintain their painful problem. So for me, the dry forest is saying, one of the things that I found was saying to someone, it's your stress is a problem. Most people, don't conceptually understand that stress would cause pain. And actually, I don't think there's great data there either, if I'm being honest. I don't know if there's a direct link between stress and pain being directly causative when you look at the mechanisms, right? And that goes for smoking and alcohol. But what they likely do is make the forest dry. And the reason is when the forest is dry, does it take a little bit less load to spark the fire, right? Or does it take a smaller spark to get everything going? So when the forest is very dry, because of all these different factors we have in our lives, it doesn't take much to spark that problem into life. And I find that conceptualization of risk factor or contributor is easier to sell than that direct relationship of you had a bad night's sleep, that caused your pain. Well, actually, pain and sleep have a bi-directional relationship. But we know that, it's probably not nice to do anything when you haven't slept very well, right? Because it affects our functioning at an executive level, at a global level. It affects the ecosystem, whether that's inflammatory, whether it's cognition, we don't know. It is likely to contribute to the problem, not always directly cause it. And I think that's what it's about. It's about creating a model of causation that's not always super direct. And that I find people are much more able to understand that separation and that it contributes to the ecosystem rather than your sleep caused your pain or your stress causes your pain or your negative thoughts cause your pain. Because there's just not really any data behind that.
Yeah. So the dry forest analogy can help replace all these other stories the patients potentially could hear, including some of the biomechanical explanations.
So could your knee valgus spark your problem into life, if you were going for a period of intense stress and you're smoking 30 cigarettes a day and I'm chugging down a bottle of whiskey and my wife hates me and my kids are playing up at school and I'm not sleeping very well, right? Mm-hmm. So could my knee valgus be a bit more important when the forest is dry? I don't know, potentially. But it's a way of trying to tie all these things in together. So I see causation in three ways. Firstly, what puts us at risk of the problem, right? So risk factors. What is a trigger for the problem? And most people would see that as bending over or reaching up and hurting my shoulder or playing a game of tennis, etc. And then we have maintainers, which I generally see as psychological factors. And these are things that affect our behaviors over time that maintain the problem. And I think psychological factors fit into the maintaining part much better than they do into the causative or the trigger part.
So when you say that, can you go a layer deep? What do you mean by that?
So let's take prognostic factors. So prognostic factors are things that delay recovery, right? So a prognosis is what I think about your recovery. So if you are 25, Jimmy, are you 25?
I'm 41 years old.
Oh, you're old, right? So look, but not as old as me.
Wait, time out. I just shave off the gray beard so you can't tell.
Yeah, well, exactly. I've got all mine on full glow. I've got more grey than anything else now, my friend. So nice. if we think about some of the prognostic factors that we have, expectations of recovery is a really big prognostic factor. So does my expectation of recovery cause me to have worse pain? No, it likely affects the behaviours that I take while I have my pain. If I don't expect to recover, am I more likely to stay at home, eat Pringles, watch Netflix and drink some beer? Probably. Whereas if I expect to recover, I'm going to get out there, I'm going to do all of the things associated with recovery. Pain self-efficacy, that's another really big prognostic factor. So pain self-efficacy means doing things despite having pain. So if we think about this one, if I never engage in anything that hurts, if I don't engage in things that have value for me and that I enjoy, is that likely to make my problem worse? Absolutely. So I think most of these psychological factors affect our behaviors and tend to affect prognosis over time, rather than suddenly my expectations in my brain cause a descending modulation. And, that's really wild science, if you ask me. I think the link is much more behavioral than it is mechanistic.
So I think a lot of times when we think about that, we think about the people that are fearful or avoiding things. What about the opposite, where I work with a lot of endurance athletes and they are kind of that persistent coper, or they're just constantly overdoing it. You tell them to back off, they're still doing an hour a day and wondering why they're not getting better.
Yeah, if you look at pain self-efficacy, it's on a U shape. So if you look at the top end of the U, too little is not very good, but too much is not very good either. My example of that is people who develop a stress fracture, right? So, I always describe it as the head is stronger than the body, right? Whereas I think people that tend to avoid, sometimes their bodies are stronger than their heads. So if I'm a runner and I'm just like, oh my God, my leg is fractured, it's falling off, but I'm just going to pop out and do 5K because I feel like it, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So pain self-efficacy can also be too high as well. So a lot of these things are on a U shape. Everything's on a U shape. Too much is often negative. Not enough is often negative as well.
So then go back to the risk factors. What are some of these risk factors that you're alluding to?
Yeah. So look, I think if we look at so the big one actually, I think, is physical inactivity. So we know that physical inactivity, and there is an argument as well. If I brought out someone like my good friend, Derek Griffin, who I've sparred with over the years, and I love Derek would say to me, it's probably bi-directional. So if you have long-term persistent pain, are you less likely to be active? Whereas at the same point, we do see low activity, and the answer would be the same for both cases, right, though, wouldn't it? So we do see that low physical activity tends to be a risk factor for any type of painful problem in the body. We know that when we're more active, we're more likely to have, an anti-inflammatory or an anti-nociceptive environment within the body. We know that activity and movement have effects on the immune system, have an effect on the nociceptive system. Our opioid systems function better when we are fitter. I posted a study recently looking at CV fitness. If you are cardiovascularly fit, your odds of chronic pain are lower. That's just the long and the short of it, right? Is there going to be bidirectionality? Yes, Derek, there will. But, we still can't deny that there's an association. So we see physical activity. The other one we actually see is a high body mass index. So things like adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is being described now as an inflammatory organ. So we're creating low-grade inflammatory scenarios in the body. That's where the forest gets dry. So, it's not your biomechanical weight. It's actually the inflammatory nature of adipose tissue that's creating, the environment for the spark.
Yeah. And it makes me think both of those, though, are also U-shaped, right? Because we can be, if we're overactive or too active, we are not as healthy. We see this in some of these elite runners where they're very fast, very fit and good at running, but they're very unhealthy in everything else in life. And then same thing with body weight, where I can think of someone I'm currently working with, which is on the very low end of body weight. And I believe that's probably contributing to her dry forest.
Absolutely. So again, when we have low body fat or low body weight, two different things. Again, we see things like relative energy deficiency. We see changes in female hormones, periods. Again, so I'm going back to university. It's the balance between the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts, isn't it? Estrogen has an effect on that relationship. And because of that, you are creating a pro-bone eating environment, aren't you? Right? So again, that might be because you're underfueled. It might be because you're underrested. So again, the forest is very, very dry. So absolutely, all of these things are on a U shape.
So we had risk factors, we had maintainers, and then what about the trigger? Can you dive into that for a second?
Well, I think the triggers are what we most talk about, right? So, someone will bend over, their back will hurt, and you'll go, oh my God, it's because you flexed badly. Or, oh my God, it must be your disc, right? So we jump to the anatomy or we jump to the movement and we say, because you did this, it must be, this problem. So I think we're very, very good at identifying and creating stories around the trigger. And the trigger still might be relevant, but the risk and the maintainers are also equally as relevant. And that's a complexity model, right? This is biological complexity, not biomechanical simplicity.
Yeah. If you were to get really practical, can you give us an example of how you would communicate this to a patient?
Well, again, the dry forest analogy, it's pointing out for that person which of those factors are likely to make the forest dry. And one of the big things I often talk about to people is so let's take two examples. One example would be the person that doesn't do enough. My focus there would be on positive lifestyle. It would be on what's the smallest things that we can do to be a bit more active, to be a bit more healthy? My focus would never be on body mass and adipose tissue. That would come as a product of being healthier to reduce those.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get into the other side of it, let's say we have athletic patients, etc., then I'm really looking at saying, you know what, recovery is the real key. You know, you're not allowing enough time for your body to get into a positive homeostasis, right? So if you're not fueling enough, if you're not sleeping enough, you are just not allowing your body to biologically adapt and biologically repair. So again, I mean, I don't know if this analogy resonates, but I often say to people that when you're a professional athlete, you're really not being paid to train. You're not being paid to play the sport. You're being paid to rest. Because at the end of the day, how many people have to do both? So they play their sport, but then they also have to go to work. And they're the people often that I find are affected the most. So triathletes who have to do a job, but maybe I remember a really, a case that I had probably about 15 years ago, of a girl who I was working with, and she was Team GB, so British Olympic athlete, but she couldn't get enough funding to give up her job in plastic surgery. So she was a plastic surgery nurse. So she still had to go and do all of this stuff and also train 35 hours a week. How the hell is that going to work? Right?
Yeah, no clue.
So, and part of the problem with that is it's not modifiable, but it is talking about optimizing sleep. So she used to do things like she used to go for a swim at 10 p.m. at night and then get back to the gym at 7 a.m. in the morning. And I had to point out that probably isn't doing you that many favors, right?
Correct.
More is not always better.
I love the dry forest analogy. For me personally in the clinic, it does help. I've been practicing for 12 years, and so maybe not as long as you, but when I first graduated, the clinic I was at was heavy biomechanical, spinal manipulation, and talking to patients that way. And then, so that was my first era. My second era was pain science and going down that rabbit hole. I remember reading Louis Pudenter's book and trying to educate everyone on neuroscience. And that story was so complicated, didn't really help. And then as I've been evolving, it's trying to figure out a better, more helpful story that I can give to the patients. And this dry forest really does seem to make a ton of sense. It's easy to tie into the individual in front of you and make it make sense for them. So I think I love it. I was so happy the first time I heard you talk about it. I'm glad to hear you explain it a little bit more for us today. Anything else you want to tell us about the dry forest? I want to switch gears in a second.
No, it's a pretty simple analogy. And one thing I want to say about all analogies is they are unlikely to resonate with everyone. So there is no such thing as a killer perfect analogy. For some people, it will be the best thing that you've ever told them. They'll do a cartwheel out of the clinic, they'll fly a plane, I don't know. And then other people, it will be like, why the hell are you telling me?
Yeah.
So analogies are about as variable as everything else we have in the rehab world. That's my finishing statement on that.
Got it. All right. Well, so then maybe this will tie in, but so now that you're doing all this mentorship work with Better Clinician Project and then your own stuff, when you are working with a clinician and talking to them about this stuff, I'm sure it comes up where maybe you're going over a case and I can think of some cases I have now where maybe the patient comes to you and they've been told all these biomechanical stories and we're trying to help them move past that. Do you have any advice for the young clinicians that's going through that, trying to help shift the patient in front of you from this heavy biomechanical explanation, freaking out about structure and anterior pelvic tilt, all these things, because I think we're constantly straddling this. We don't want to offend the patient or tell them that they're wrong. Everything they're saying is wrong, but we also want to help shift them a little bit. What advice do you have for us? One
thing that I've noticed about, and I've taught a lot of clinicians in about 40 countries over the last 20 years. So I'm going to feel reasonably qualified to say this, is that sometimes people worry too much about what other people think. They get paralyzed by, oh my God, what if the patient doesn't like what I've got to say? Or what if they don't believe me? Or, and I hear this most of the problems we have are actually in the head, not in the patient. Right? So it's actually
in the clinician's head.
Yeah. And I actually think that's a positive thing because it shows how much people care, but also it shows how much people are racked by, wanting to please and, the whole question of is satisfaction important? And I have that discussion all the time. Sometimes we create short-term satisfaction, but long-term problems, right? So you might tell a patient something that's easy to understand, but actually down the line, does that cause more problems? Right. So short-term satisfaction is often not my goal, because I realize that sometimes the more satisfied someone is, that could actually be, someone might go, oh, my knee is falling in. That's why it hurts. Muy bueno. And then they don't go running anymore because their knee is falling in. So you are satisfying them in one breath, but in another breath, you're creating another problem. Right. So short-term satisfaction is a game of two swords, two edges of a sword. MRI is the best example. Who doesn't want an MRI? Not many people. Everyone wants an MRI. But when they get it, can it cause problems?
Sure.
So we have satisfaction in the beginning, but we don't always have a better outcome at the end. And I think that's something that everyone needs to think about. Short-term satisfaction may not be the end game. But so firstly, don't think too much about, oh, what are they going to think about me? They will think what they think. But I think the first point I have is sometimes I don't try to fight their beliefs. I don't try to give them another belief. I just get on with it. Does that make sense? So sometimes the best thing is just to say, oh, look, I've had people go, oh, my posture's really bad. And I'll go, well, I can check that for you.
Yeah.
So I'll go, no, seems fine to me. Yeah. There's no data to tell me what's good or bad. So I can quite confidently say your posture's fine. Right?
Yeah.
But the idea of experiential learning, I think, is important. Sometimes the best way to help people is to show them things, not tell them things. So actually say, well, let's see what you can do with that, or let's do this exercise and see what happens. You did really, really well there, right? So when it comes to things like exercise, we often focus on those negatives, those flaws. And actually, I'll just go, well, let's do an exercise and I just won't bring it up. I'll just go, good rep. Oh, what a lovely rep. And actually, by the end of it, they may not even think about it. We only have these problems because we focus on them, because we've invented them. And then we have this expectation. Sometimes you just actually need to just get on with it and do something.
Yeah. So it's like, get out of your own way, get out of your head. Don't worry so much about what you think you think they're going to respond to you saying whatever it is.
So if you get out of your head, are you more likely to help the patient get out of their head?
Yeah.
And I have a funny little saying, don't let the worst enemy live between your two ears. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have, both clinicians and patients.
I had a patient in here earlier this morning I feel, when we get caught up and you take responsibility for this person getting better and you put a lot of pressure on yourself and you got to do everything right. And I was feeling that with this patient and trying to let it go and just do what I would do naturally without those expectations that I was putting onto myself. And yeah, sometimes it's just like, even now, 12 years into practice, I still feel it, and it's learning to let it go, I think.
But what does it say about you, Jimmy? It says that you probably give a shit about whether people recover, right? Which is a huge positive. We can't say that's not a positive. I think sometimes the problem is that there are too many. My analogy here again, I don't know if this is a little bit morbid, but if you are a cancer doctor, can you still do a great job, but your patients die?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And why is that any different? So could you have a patient with long-term persistent pain, multiple comorbidities, loads of things going on? Could you still do a great job, but you don't get them 100% pain-free?
Sure.
And I think that's a better way to view it, is your skills are not predicated on the outcomes of this person, because genetics are playing a role.
Mm-hmm.
Previous treatment. How many patients do I have that have had multiple operations, multiple injections? They're on gabapentin, pregabalin, various other wonderful lotions and potions, right? I can do my best job and I can help these people, but, I'm only quite a simple human being, right? So if I'm going to... Yeah. So just think sometimes you can do a fantastic job and the outcome measure isn't pain.
Is not, yeah. It makes me think, like, personally, I have a pretty severe hip OA. Been told I need a hip replacement. I'm young. I'm trying to push it off, but thinking about me going and seeing a PT, it's like, there's only so much we can do with what I got going on. I can't run no matter what we do right now. Yeah.
And hip OA is a classic example of when biomechanics are not that important, right? Not for the genesis of the problem or for the cure. In fact, OA doesn't have a cure. Exercise does not cure OA. It simply manages it a little bit better, right? And even then, it's not very effective against the thing about OA is genetics, right? So, you can blame the family. You shouldn't too much, but...
Come on, Dad.
Come on, parents. But the point is, are you likely to go and see the best PT in the world and your hip is going to magically get better? Of course not. Could you manage it better for a while? Of course. Yeah, but, it's not a cure. It's not a fix.
Yep. Yeah. At least how I've been trained, it's like, for especially early in my career, it's like, you got to fix everyone. That's how you're judging whether you're good or not. And I remember talking to patients about, I'll never forget having like maybe 10, let's say like 7 years ago, a patient post-op, total knee, one of those ones that just like the flexion was not coming. And I kept saying like, oh, you just gotta let it go. You gotta let it go. She was trying so hard, multiple manipulations, but around that time, the Frozen, you have kids?
My son is 15, Jimmy.
Do you remember, did they ever watch Frozen?
I am aware of Frozen. I don't know if he was particularly into it.
I have two boys. Mine are 5 and 4, and then a little girl that's 1. And the boys, the 5-year-old, we had to watch Cars, I don't know, 100 times.
Yes.
And time out. Did you watch all 3 of them?
Jimmy, I've seen so many things that I don't remember. I remember the best sleep I ever had was during the Lego Batman movie. I do remember that. So I've seen all of these things, but I've also slept through quite a lot of them as well.
There you go. Anyways, back to the Frozen. The idea of letting it go was, there was a song in the movie, Let It Go, whatever. But yeah, I think for me, learning to let it go is like letting go of that responsibility. Yes, I care, and I'm going to try my best to get this person better. But at the end of the day, I got to let the outcome go, and it's up to them to get better. And maybe sometimes, like me with my OA, it is what it is.
Or also managing it successfully, or managing it successfully for a period of time is still a powerful thing.
Very, very much so. Yeah.
Right.
I agree. Yeah. And that's kind of where I'm at personally. Yeah. It's like I figured out what I can do, what I can't do, and doing more of what I can do.
And that's called self-efficacy, isn't it? So you improve your self-efficacy to effectively self-manage, Yes. And I'm going to say one thing here. Maybe chronic pain is more about management than cure. I think sometimes we look at some chronic pain as you need to find the off switch. And actually, it might be more like chronic health condition than it is like simply a musculoskeletal damage. And I think we may need to think about how do we manage these things better rather than where's the off switch.
Yeah, that can be a tough pill to swallow for somebody.
100%.
Yeah, because it's like one person looks at it as acceptance, another as like giving up.
Absolutely. I don't know. It's above my pay grade to answer that question.
Yeah, no.
I'm just highlighting the problem.
All right, Ben, I want to be respectful of your time. This has been really helpful to kind of hear you talk more about this balance between biomechanics, what it can tell us, what it can't tell us, this idea of thinking more about biomechanics as how load is applied or how the body is being loaded, and then us trying to pay more attention to and to really start learning to think about what is the body's response to that load. And then we got this great dry forest analogy as a way to communicate things to patients. So I really appreciate you, taking the time to come on here. Where can listeners learn more about you?
I am very hard to find on the internet. No, I'm not. So I like to. We got into the whole social media thing when it was in its genesis about 15, 16 years ago. So it's become a little bit of a habit for me. Although you won't catch me doing silly dances and stuff like that.
Come on.
But no, I'm on Instagram, and I only actually use Instagram anymore. I think everything else has gone, moved on. But I'm not quite at TikTok yet. I haven't got the skill sets for that. So
don't do
really
it.
On Instagram and various conferences and courses all over the place.
Awesome. Well, we'll put a link into your Instagram, and everyone go check that out, along with Better Clinician Project. And then, is it Core Kinetic?
COR-KINETIC. Yes, Core Kinetic.
Awesome. Yes, everyone go check Ben out. And until next time, thank you so much, Ben. That's it for today on the Physio Insights Podcast, presented by Run Easy. Would you like to share an interesting case, insight, or have a thought about the podcast? Comment below, and don't forget to follow us for more episodes.